This podcast is made possible by you, the supporters of WPLN and WNXP, Nashville Public Radio.
This is the Nash Villager Podcast. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. This weekend, a really important figure in Tennessee history died. Winfield Dunn had been out of the public eye for quite a few years. I suspect a lot of folks who were younger or newer to the area may have never even heard of him. But as a one-term governor back in the 1970s, Dunn oversaw a fundamental shift in this state's politics. And he did it as a kind, thoughtful gentleman and statesman. To understand Dunn's importance, you've got to know the lay of the land in the decades before he took office. From the end of Reconstruction right up through the late 60s, Tennessee was resoundingly Democratic territory. As much of a hold as the Republicans have on the state now, the Democrats had even more in the early 20th century. In the cities, the suburbs, and in small rural towns, the vast majority of Tennesseans only ever voted for Democrats. Period. Some of those Democrats were progressive in some ways. A lot of them were Dixiecrats, the kind of social conservative that would later defect to the Republican Party. But for decade upon decade, one party had a lockhold on Tennessee government. Generally speaking, that much control breeds corruption, and Tennessee was no exception. Then came Winfield Dunn. He was a dentist with an interest in politics, not a politician per se, and he was a Republican. Dunn lived in Memphis, where he saw the waning influence of the long-standing boss-crump political machine, which was about as corrupt as could be. He became active in the party that opposed Crump, helping GOP challengers in their campaigns and gaining the attention of state party leaders. In 1968, for the first time, the Republicans won a statewide office, sending Howard Baker to the U.S. Senate. And coming off that win, they recruited Dunn to be the first serious GOP candidate for governor in a half-century on the 1970 ballot. To say Tennessee voters weren't used to taking Republican candidates seriously would be an understatement. Honestly, they weren't used to even thinking of Republicans as having candidates. Years ago, I had the opportunity to interview Governor Dunn, and he recalled having to devote campaign resources to putting out reminders that the general election was a thing. People were so used to the primary being the deciding ballot that a lot of regular voters just weren't in the habit of showing up for the general at all. His Democratic opponent took Dunn seriously enough to suggest they have a televised debate. Dunn declined in favor of a more old-school option. Like Lincoln and Douglas did in Illinois a century earlier, Winfield Dunn and John J. Hooker held a series of in-person debates at spots around the state. It was a political roadshow that grabbed folks' attention. And it worked. Over the course of the election, it went from Winfield who to a Dunn victory. But becoming the first Republican governor in most people's memory was just the first step. Dunn had to figure out a way to govern when the state legislature was chock full of the other team. Every step was hard fought, but Dunn appointed a bipartisan cabinet and charged them with identifying and cleaning up corruption and with finding ways to push the state forward. One story he told me in that interview was about license plates. There was a custom of granting special license plate numbers to government officials and their family members. Anyone who knew about the system could know exactly how important or well-connected the driver was by looking at that number, because they were markedly different from everyone else. Normal folks had a whole string of digits, but the governor's car had a simple number 1 on the plate. The person closest to him had a 2, and so on. Low digits meant a VIP. Single digits telegraphed that the car belonged to one of the most powerful Tennesseans. Officially speaking, it was just a number, but law enforcement all knew exactly what that meant, and the assumption, probably a safe one, was that cars with very low license plate numbers simply would not be pulled over for any reason. When Dunn took office, the requests for new plates with certain numbers came in pretty much immediately. He refused to play that game. There was a lot of fuss, but ultimately he ended the custom. That's just one of a lot of little things that had crept in over time. The state needed someone from outside the long-running establishment to identify and clean up those messes, and Dunn was the man for the job. He also created a state department to bring new jobs to Tennessee communities. He brought kindergarten to schools across the state. He signed into law an act to create legal protections for natural spaces like Radnor Lake and Fall Creek Falls. But I think the biggest impact of Dunn's administration is that he began a period of bipartisan governing in this state that lasted nearly 3 decades. Nobody could take their offices for granted. Neither party could just assume it would always get its way. For a while after Dunn's governorship, that office changed hands. Republicans followed into the office by Democrats, and vice versa. And something I find notable and interesting is that Dunn broke the long chain of one-party leadership not by being a firebrand, but by being a nice and reasonable guy. I came away from my time speaking to him feeling like I had just talked to one of the most gentlemanly people I'd ever met. He was very kind, very smart. He clearly thought deeply about the things he said before he said them. For a long time, I think you could see Dunn's influence on the state's Republican leaders. Many often said they consulted with him on weighty matters. Sadly, around the same time that we started to hear whispers of a decline on his part, there were signs that his calming and grounding influence was waning. That was before the GOP gained a majority and then a supermajority in the General Assembly. Perhaps the most telling sign of who Winfield Dunn was as a person comes from an unlikely friendship. After the 1970 election, Dunn and his Democratic opponent, John J. Hooker, became buddies. They had a great deal of respect for each other. They shared a passionate interest in the well-being of Tennessee. They both came from a place of truly wanting the best for people here, even if they disagreed on the details. And they just liked each other. They would talk through those ideas while taking long, meandering drives along back roads. They did that for years. Winfield Dunn died on Saturday. He was 97 years old. He's survived by his wife and 3 kids. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank him for raising someone who's been a dear, dear friend to this station. Back in the days when we invited community members to come on the air and help raise money for WPLN, the governor's son, Chuck Dunn, was one of our all-stars. There is, of course, another election coming up in a little over a month. Tonight, WPLN will air NPR coverage of the vice presidential debate. That starts at 8 p.m. And in just a few minutes, we're gearing up for Election Day with answers to voter questions. That's coming up after the newscast.
Thematic Static on WNXP is the mixtape we make together. A themed set loosely organized by you, the listener, handpicking songs according to a theme. Airing first Thursdays at 9 a.m. and again Saturdays at 9 a.m., Thematic Static plucks your requests from the socials at WNXP Nashville and by voice memo at 615-320-9100. Thematic Static, the mixtape we make together, supported by United Record Pressing, only on WNXP.
Here's the latest from WPLN News. Tennessee has now confirmed 6 deaths in the state from Hurricane Helene, and approximately 100 people were still missing as of yesterday afternoon. Patrick Sheehan, director of the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency, says he expects the number of fatalities to rise in the coming days.
When we lose Tennesseans, when we lose friends, families, and neighbors, that makes this disaster a tragic disaster.
About 7,000 Tennesseans were still without power for the 4th night in a row, and many people don't have running water. The storm has now impacted 20 drinking water facilities and some wastewater treatment plants, and 5 counties issued advisories to boil water for safety. TEMA says getting bottled water to affected people has been a top priority. The National Guard is also airlifting water to some isolated areas. Additional recovery efforts this week will be focused on stabilizing critical infrastructure and clearing roads. The governor has requested an expedited major disaster declaration for 8 counties. As recovery efforts ramp up in East Tennessee, well-meaning people may be inclined to donate things they believe can help. But that may not be what is needed at the moment. Sheehan is asking people to hold off for now before responding to the devastation caused by Hurricane Helene.
In a week, we'll probably need help with cleanup. We'll need people whose homes were maybe not destroyed but were flooded. We'll need help mucking out. We'll need help beautifying the community. We'll need help in ways that I can't even imagine right now that will surface and make a lot of sense at the time. The immediate things is cash.
Financial contributions to reputable organizations on the ground, such as the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and United Way, help support the immediate health and safety needs of survivors. Because, as Sheehan points out, someone whose home was just destroyed by floodwaters may not be in need of a donated couch. East Tennessee got up to 8 inches of rain over 3 days last week. That's a lot of rain, though nowhere near records. But several rivers and dams recorded their highest ever peaks. So what happened? WPLN's Caroline Eggers breaks down the mechanics of how Hurricane Helene impacted Tennessee.
First off, this was 2 storms. A cold front from the west dropped heavy rain in both Tennessee and North Carolina on Wednesday. Then, the heat-fueled remnants of Hurricane Helene swept through Thursday and Friday. Will Tollefson, Tennessee's assistant state climatologist, says we were saturated even before Helene arrived.
The combination of those 2 different weather systems really just was what made those 3-day rainfall totals shoot up into that pretty rare amounts.
Not so much in Tennessee, but across the state line, some areas got hit really hard. Yancey County in North Carolina got 24 inches of rain over those 3 days. And that water didn't stay there. It flowed from North Carolina's mountains into Tennessee's valleys, via streams and rivers. And that's why we were breaking records in Tennessee. The Pigeon River, for example, rose to 29 feet. Tollefson says,
Major flood stage is 12.
The Nolichucky River also probably broke a record, but that gauge either washed away or got damaged. We do know, right before the gauge stopped reporting Friday, that river levels doubled in just 4 hours that morning. But the stormwater didn't stop there. The Tennessee Valley Authority captured a lot of water through its system of dams and reservoirs. TVA is now slowly releasing water from its Douglas Dam into the French Broad River. That flows into the Tennessee River, which flows into the Ohio, onto the Mississippi, and then the Gulf of Mexico, back where the hurricane first formed. Caroline Eggers, WPLN News.
The last day to register to vote in Tennessee is fast approaching. Potential voters have 1 week left before the October 7th deadline. As WPLN's Power and Equity reporter Miriam explains, it's not the only deadline voters should keep in mind.
If you want to vote by mail in Tennessee, your county election board has to receive your request by Tuesday, October 29th. Now, in most counties, you can send your application by email, fax, or mail. But if you're mailing it in, you're going to want to do that several days before the deadline. If you request an absentee ballot, you can't change your mind and try to vote in person later. If you request an absentee ballot, you can't change your mind and try to vote in person later. If you do plan to vote in person, the early voting period runs from the middle of the month, October 16th, to the end. You'll need to bring a Tennessee driver's license, a U.S. passport, or any other government ID that has both your name and your photo. So no library cards or student IDs. Mariana Baca-Yao, WPLN News.
You can find more information like how to check your registration status and find your polling place online at wpln.org/election. For 5 years, local historian Bridget Jones had designed and given tours at the Belmead Historic Site and Winery. Visitors learned about the plantation's history of slavery by hearing stories about the more than 100 enslaved people who lived there during the 19th century. Jones left her job last year, but she tells News Channel 5 she's worried her former employer will rewrite her tour's stories by sanitizing the history and include more fun facts to lighten the mood. Belmead's management is not denying the tour is changing, but they told News Channel 5 that Belmead has the responsibility as a public historical institution to ensure that all tours are historically accurate, engaging, and thought-provoking. Jones says any attempt to make the subject of slavery less uncomfortable would be wrong. She says, quote, "There's no amount of wine and mint juleps that's going to take away what those spaces and places did to American history." You'll find more news anytime at WPLN.org. Tennessee's deadline to register to vote is now about a week away. Residents who want to cast ballots for the presidential race, seats in Congress and the State House, the national transit referendum, among other contests, have until this Monday, October 7th, to register. Cool Ekelona and This is Nashville recently hosted Dorinda Smith with the League of Women Voters and Pratik Dash with the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition to field voting questions from residents. This excerpt provides a glimpse into what voters are thinking and wondering about.
Cassandra, thank you so much for being with us today. What is your question or comment?
Hi, I am curious about how I've heard that Republicans are trying to make voters declare their party before voting, I guess, in the primaries. And I don't identify as either Republican or Democrat. And so how does that prevent or intimidate voters from voting in the first place because maybe they don't want to choose a party? And I don't know, what are the steps that people in Tennessee are taking to prevent that from happening?
Are you mentioning primaries or the general election?
That's one of the things I feel like I am underinformed about, because I know that you have to pick in the primaries between Republican or Democrat, but I feel like they're trying to do it I thought that they were trying to do it in the general election as well, but maybe I am wrong.
Dorinda?
In Tennessee right now, you do not have to register at a party affiliation. There is no registration. There's no website that says I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. So while there is a law on the books that has been on the books for 50 years that says that only a bona fide member of a party can vote in that primary, it's not enforceable because there's no definition for bona fide. Yeah, it's a little confusing, and there's not going to be an impact to the presidential election. Certainly on a general election, you don't have to declare your party.
All right. Thank you so much for that call, Cassandra. Really appreciate it. Our phone lines are blazing. We got Matt in Ashland City. Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks for calling. What's your question or comment, my friend?
Hey, folks. I just want to say I'm motivated to vote this year because there's actually socialist candidates on the ballot. Claudia De La Cruz and Karina Garcia will be on the ballot this year in Tennessee. We don't have to settle for the two major capitalist parties. There is a grassroots socialist alternative that we have this year.
Thank you for that comment, Matt. Now, you said that you're excited to vote this year because of these candidates that you just mentioned that you support. Is this unusual for you? Are you normally generally excited to vote, or is it something that you kind of pass on?
No, I'm generally not excited to vote because most years there's just the Republicans and the Democrats on the ballot. And neither of those parties, I believe, represent the working class.
Excellent. Okay, so you both are working with people to register them to vote, to inform them about the vote. You're not telling them who to vote for. That's up to them. It's up to all individual choices. Have you noticed an uptick in enthusiasm this election cycle?
It was interesting. We did have a voter registration activity at the library in Williamson County on Tuesday for the National Registration Day. And I was kind of shocked at how many people came to our table to talk about registering. They'd already registered, but they were excited about the election, or they were new and had not registered, and we were happy to be able to point them to how they could register online. But everybody was pretty excited when we told them if they were registered when that early voting started October 16th and what the locations were in Franklin. They were pretty pumped about it. So, yeah, I think this election's going to bring some numbers out. I'm hoping that we get the participation that we need.
Pratik?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, I think the presidential election years, we always see a little bit of an uptick. There's something about election on TV all the time. I think the thing that, Matt sort of touched on and other folks have touched on is that it's not always about the top of the ticket, especially in a state like Tennessee. One thing I want to make sure listeners understand is that, we want to make sure that everyone votes, not just, at the president level, but all the way down the ballot. There's folks that are state representatives. There are local elections. There's so many elections of people that affect your everyday life that are on the ballot in this election. We see a lot of ballot drop off. A lot of people just vote for president and then head back home. And so really want to encourage all the listeners to tell your friends and family to vote all the way down the ballot, because I think it's so important. Those local races affect your life just as much as the top of the ticket.
The lower you get down in the ballot, the higher it is a priority for you.
Absolutely. The closer it touches your life.
You can hear the full hour-long Q&A with leaders of voter support organizations by visiting the This Is Nashville podcast feed. We do this roundup of Nashville news every weekday, so subscribe in your favorite podcasting app to make sure you never miss an episode. And if you like this, you'll probably enjoy the Nashvillager newsletter, too. You'll get perspective from more of my colleagues at Nashville Public Radio and links to the stories we're following. Sign up for those daily emails at wpln.org/Nashvillager. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. Let's make this day a good one, and we'll catch back up tomorrow.